We are going to look at the next outstanding personality in the book of Genesis in sequence, and his name is Jacob. Now, this does not mean we're skipping over Isaac. We will, as we study Jacob, learn what we need to about Isaac. But Jacob is clearly the more dominant personality in terms of God's future plans. And so, as we did in the first hour, I want us to focus first on a moment in Jacob's life when he reaches the peak of his spiritual growth. That is, not that he didn't grow anymore after this, but the heart of what made Jacob a great man of God. And the passage that I want to begin with then is found in the 32nd chapter. The setting for the words that I'm going to read are that Jacob is facing an angry brother, Esau. He has left behind him an angry uncle, Laban. He's caught in between. He can't go back, and ahead of him is a brother that had threatened to kill him the next time he had a chance. It's at this point when Jacob really does a lot of soul searching in his life. Now, if you think Abraham had problems, just wait till you study the life of Jacob. He made a wreck and an utter mess of his life until God took charge and began to bring it back together, making some order out of a rather chaotic circumstance. But in this setting now, he's tried all of his cleverness, and all of his cleverness has gotten him into some real serious trouble. As I said, he's made enemies of everybody he's dealt with, and his enemies seem to be closing in on him. And suddenly, it's as though he discovers God. Not that he hasn't known him, but suddenly he's brought humbly to his knees. And this is his prayer, beginning in 32:9. Jacob said, O God of my father Abraham and God of my father Isaac, O Lord, who said to me, return to your country and to your kindred, and I will do you good. I am not worthy of the least of all the truth which you have showed to your servant. With my staff I passed over the Jordan, and now have become two companies. Deliver me, I pray, from the hand of my brother, from the hand of Esau. I fear him, because lest he come and smite me, the mother and the children. And you said, I will surely do you good, and make your seed as the sand of the sea, which cannot be numbered for multitude. Now here is the grandson of Abraham. And quite unlike his father Abraham, he had not lived by faith in his early years after he had come to know God. He had tried to manipulate God and bargain with God just as he did with others. And always he tried to outwit other people. But he had now been completely outwitted by his enemies, and he recognized this. For the first time, he recognized that he was spiritually bankrupt and that he was not worthy of any of the things God had given him. If you'd asked him this a few days before, he would have probably said, yes, I earned everything God gave me. But now he really knows that he's not worth anything. He hasn't earned anything. And all he can think about is the loving kindness and truth of God shown to him. And in that moment then, we see a great transformation take place in the life of Jacob. But it didn't just happen suddenly. There was a building up to this point, a building up to the time when he would, as he does now, utterly, totally rely on God for his deliverance. So we will, as we've done before, we'll go back to the beginning of the development of the account of Jacob. And we'll see that while Jacob was a slow learner, God had from the beginning intended him for a great purpose. We'll come back in our survey to the end of the 22nd chapter and on into the 23rd chapter, in which we see here more information about Abraham and his family. We're told at the beginning of chapter 23 that Sarah died in Hebron, and she was buried in what we come to know as the cave of Machpelah, which Abraham bought. Abraham owned no land. Even he didn't own enough land in Canaan to bury his wife. And he had to go find a suitable burying place and then try to buy it for her. And we're told in chapter 23 of that. Then in chapter 24, we're given to understand that Abraham now was an old man. And he says was stricken in age. The Lord had blessed him in all things. And Abraham was concerned at this point about his son Isaac. He did not want him to marry the pagan women of Canaan, the daughters of the Canaanites, as he said here. And he sent his servant to find a wife before his death, a wife from his own country and from his own people. Now we know that his own country and his own people had not been strong worshipers of God, and evidently there was some knowledge and some interchange between Abraham and his people, and perhaps some growing knowledge of God among them. At least of all the people Abraham knew on earth, he thought a wife for Isaac could be best found among his own ancestors and living family. Chapter 24 gives the account of that, and it tells us something then about Abraham, that he had come to understand the importance of a holy seed. That is, the importance, if God's truth was to be carried down as he was told he must do, instruct his children in righteousness and justice, so that they may go in the way of the Lord. If that was to be accomplished, then it must be in a context of belief. And so he understood what we all must understand, that neither you and I nor our children should be, as Paul put it, unequally yoked with unbelievers in marriage or in any other circumstance that would lead us to compromise. The Bible tells us something that rather surprises us in the early part of chapter 25. Abraham lived quite a while after Sarah, and it mentions here a wife, Keturah, and several children that are born of Keturah. And yet Abraham gave everything he had to Isaac because he'd learned well the lesson, the painful lesson from Ishmael. And that is that he was not to bring these children into the home in any way so that they would interfere with Isaac and his life. Of course, by now Isaac was a grown man. And he sent them away so that Isaac would understand that uniquely it was his responsibility to carry on the promises of God, through those promises, the family of God among the Israelites, as they would later be called. Verse 8 tells us simply that Abraham died and that he was buried. And that's the end of the life and history of Abraham. It makes us aware of the fact that there was a great deal in his life to which the Bible gives no attention in the latter part of his life. But by then he was quite old, not able to move about very much. Then the focus of attention moves to Isaac, and more so to Jacob ultimately. Isaac's a kind of a valley between two mountain peaks, if you want to put it that way. Abraham and Jacob are certainly the dominating personalities. Isaac was very reserved, didn't have much to say, was never very forceful, never probably a very good leader. He probably would have been a much better follower than a leader. We don't learn much about him. Actually, the little bit we learn about Isaac is sort of sandwiched in between the accounts of Abraham, the end of Abraham's great career, and the beginning of Jacob's career. But Isaac did pray to the Lord because his wife was barren as Sarah. His mother had formerly been barren. He prayed to God, knowing, learning perhaps from Abraham that this is the way to go, trust in God, not in yourself. And he looked to God, and God heard, and there was formed in the womb of his wife Rebekah twins. And the Lord made a special revelation here about those twins. It's recorded in verse 23. 2 nations are in your womb, 2 peoples will separate from your bowels. The one will be stronger than the other, and the elder will serve the younger. God, you see, just didn't do things by man's way. Man's way would be the elder is the chief heir. It's still that way in many cultures today. And often even today in my country, first sons are somewhat favored and advantaged because they are the firstborn son. But God did not follow that pattern, and he plainly says here, as he showed Abraham, Ishmael may be your oldest son, but as far as I'm concerned, he's not to be your son. He's not your heir. And now he is saying to to Rebekah that there are 2 born of the same conception. Now we can see the differences between Ishmael and Isaac. They were not of the same conception, didn't have the same mother. One was a child of promise, the other was a child of compromise. But here, everything's equal. They're not only born of the same father and mother, but they're twins, born at the same time, formed in the same womb at the same time. But God makes a distinction. The elder will serve the younger. He does not even designate which will be elder and which will be younger. That won't be learned until they come forth out of her womb, and at that time then it is Esau who is born first and Jacob after him. And there's something rather symbolic in the fact that Jacob had hold of Esau's heel when he was born. And that's where he got his name. Jacob means heel. Yaakov. He was a man who would grab onto the heel of another as if to catch him and outdo him in the long run. And that pretty well sums up the nature of the man Jacob. But God had made his choice, and his choice, as Paul points out in Romans, the choice was not based at all on anything about those 2 because they were equal in every sense. The choice was God's choice. And that's the way it has to be. That's where the great doctrine of election comes to focus, and we have to understand that the reason some are saved and some are not is not because some are more clever than others, more worthy than others. God makes his choices. He's gathering his family, and he chooses as he will. Paul makes that point in Romans 9, 10, and 11, and it would be profitable to go back and read it. But here, as we go on, we see the evidence of that choice early in the days of these 2 boys as they grow up, Esau and Jacob. Esau's the he-man. He's the hunter. Jacob's a quiet man. He sits around the tents and cooks all day. Not anything we'd get very excited about. But even in this early time, there is noted in the 2 a distinct character. Jacob had a sense of spiritual values. And being the clever crook that he was, when his brother came in hungry, Jacob had been cooking. When he came in hungry and he smelled some of that cooking, he said, "Let me have some." And Jacob said, "Now's my chance." And he said, "I tell you what I'll do. You give me your birthright. Sell me your birthright, and I'll give you this." Just a mess of soup. And yet, you see the difference in spiritual values. Jacob wanted it, and even though what he was doing was wrong, is trying to take advantage of his weakness of his brother, he wanted it, and that has to be commendable. Esau couldn't care less. He was hungry. Right now, the only thing that mattered to him was satisfying that hunger pang in his stomach. And the Bible simply comments, Esau despised his birthright. Now, this shows us something then in their early age about these two young boys, and it shows a difference in character. Actually, that transaction there was of no legal value whatsoever. I mean, it was just two boys making a bargain. In and of itself, it would have no validity whatever. Just like two little boys playing, and one little boy says, "Well, I'll sell you my house if you'll give me your..." And he's okay, and he's traded. Suddenly he finds out he doesn't own a house. That kind of bargain is of no value, but it's valuable to us in showing us God working in Jacob in spite of his sinfulness. Now, as we move on into chapter 26, I'm sorry, but that's about all we learn about Isaac, chapter 26. And there are two statements that pretty well describe the man for us. It's not all bad. In verse 6, we see in 6 and 7, Isaac dwelt in Gerar, and the men of the place asked about his wife, and he said, "She's my sister." Now, where did he learn that? Like father, like son. That shows he had adopted many of his father's weaknesses. But then in verse 18, Isaac digged again the wells of water as they digged them in the days of Abraham his father, and he called them names by the names his father called them. Now, there was a certain respect for his father, and his life was a simple one, and he set a pattern to try to be as much like his father as he could. And that certainly is not all bad when your father's Abraham. Now, when Isaac was old, as chapter 27 tells us, by the way, at the end of 26, we see again the character of Esau. He goes off and marries pagan wives, wives of Hittite people, and they were a great grief to Isaac and Rebekah. But this didn't change Isaac's attitude about Esau. Remember, God had said that Jacob was to be the ruler, that in the end he would be the spiritual heir of Abraham and Isaac. But Esau saw it another way. And he called Esau when he was quite old, and he said, "Come, and I want to bless you." In other words, the blessing and the birthright and all belong to you, and I want to give it to you. And Rebekah overheard. And she told Jacob, "Now listen, he's about to pass all of these blessings and birthright and everything on to your older brother Esau, and God said you were to get it, and we've got to do something about it." And so, in a sinful way, Rebekah and her son Jacob plot to steal the birthright. Remember that Isaac himself is blind and old, and it's easy to fool him. Jacob comes in, we read in verse 18. He comes to his father and he says, "Here am I." And he says, "Who are you?" And he says, "I'm Esau." He lies. He's like his father. He's like Satan. He's behaving like a child of Satan. "I'm Esau, your firstborn, and I've done as you bade me." That is, I brought you some food to eat. And Isaac, as old as he is, and his mind maybe as feeble as it is, he has a little trouble understanding how so quickly he could go out and hunt and come back and prepare food. This leads Jacob to another lie, which is not just a lie, it's blasphemy. The Lord your God sent me good speed. Imagine what this man is saying. Here he is lying against his own father, lying to his father, cheating against his brother, and he brings the name of God into it, as if God is blessing what I'm doing here. Here's not a man of faith. Now, he had some spiritual values, but here's not a man of God. Well, he succeeded in his plot, and he received the blessing and the promises and the birthright. But let's stop and think again. Even this transaction is of no real value. The reason Jacob was blessed, the reason he was to get the birthright, was because that's what God determined. Esau's intent was to give it to Esau. Isaac's intent was to give it to Esau. Jacob stole it. But God, before either was born, had already determined that it belonged to Jacob. And from that, I think we have to conclude that God is sovereign. And even when men do evil things, sometimes God will use that evil in some way to get His truth known. But God is in control, and God is sovereign. And in spite of the sinful motivations of Rebekah and her son Jacob, God means it all for good. Well, Esau, as expected, hated Jacob, as we're told in verse 41, and threatened to kill him, and that factor will be something Jacob will not soon forget. But Isaac finally acknowledges that God's will must be done, that Jacob is God's choice, and therefore he must honor that choice. And so, to save Jacob, Rebekah and Isaac send him away to their home in Mesopotamia. On the flight away from his own home, and here's Jacob now, disenfranchised. He had tried to get the birthright, he had tried to get the blessings, the inheritance for himself, and yet he's being sent another way, really separated from all these things for a while. We're told of an experience that Jacob had one night. He saw a ladder in a dream reaching from the earth to the heaven, and angels ascending and descending upon that ladder. And he understands that he is seeing the Lord above that ladder. And he hears the promise of God, in you and your seed all the families of the earth will be blessed. I am with you. These promises then of God that were given first to Abraham are now given to Jacob also. But we see Jacob is a long way from Abraham in his spiritual growth at this point. At the end of the chapter, Jacob vowed a vow and said, if God will be with me and keep me and give me bread and raiment so that I come again to my father's house in peace, then the Lord will be my God. In other words, I will do God the favor of letting Him be my God if He will do all these good things for me. Now, one does not bargain with God in that way. It's God who initiates. It's God that determined to do good to Jacob. But Jacob's idea is he's ever the bargainer. He's ever the wheeler-dealer, trying to get the best bargain, trying to get as much as he can from others, trying to outwit and best others. And he's not afraid to try it even with God. Long way to go. Jacob goes to Laban, his uncle, and he meets his match. Now we know where he got all of his cleverness. Laban could out Jacob. Jacob said, I want to marry one of your daughters. Which one? I want to marry Rachel. She's a pretty one. Don't care much about Leah. She's too plain. Laban says, fine. He works for him 7 years. At the end of those 7 years, he's going to give him that wife. Well, he's worked hard, he's waited, he's ready. He goes in. It's hard for us to imagine how this happened, but he didn't know who was there with him that night. He woke up the next morning and he was in bed with Leah. She was his wife. Laban said, well, that's the custom. Older daughter gets married first. You didn't tell me that. Well, he had been outwitted by someone much more clever. Laban figured, now, how many years' work can I get out of this man? Let's see, 7 for his working for Rachel, and then 7 for his working for Rachel again. And that's what he did. That was the cleverness of Laban, and the man Jacob began to see the limitations of his own devices. Jacob didn't change his mind about Rachel and Leah. In verse 30 of chapter 29, he says, he loved Rachel more than Leah. And then notice the next verse. God saw, that is, God understood this to mean Leah was hated. Now this is just a simple couple of verses here. We could easily pass over it. But it opens up so much to us. And one of the things it opens up is that in biblical terminology, love and hate are relative terms. I mean by that, to love Rachel more than Leah constitutes, in God's eyes, to hate Leah. This is of great help to us in such verses as in Luke 14:26, where Jesus said, if you want to follow me, and you do not hate your father and your mother and your wife and your children and even yourself, you'll have no part with me. Now, what did Jesus mean? He simply means, if you don't love me more than all of these, you cannot be mine. Now, that doesn't mean that they were to stop loving their parents or their wife or children, but it meant that never should their love of anyone, including themselves, ever get in the way of their love of God. When Jesus was asked the first commandment, he said, it is this. The first is, you will love the Lord your God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength. You love him with everything you have. More than yourself. More than all you know. But the second is similar. It's related to it. You will love others as you love yourself. You put God first. You put then your love for your wife and family and children and even your neighbor on a par with your love for yourself. Now, that love for yourself can mean at times that because of your love for God, you'll be willing to give up your life for a friend, for someone else. Doesn't mean you love yourself any less, but you love God so much that if that's his will, you're ready to do it. So, a little verse like this can open up a lot of meaning in God's Word. Finally, God began to give children to Jacob through his 2 wives, and you know how that for the fact that Jacob didn't love Leah, God, to compensate, let her have 4 children, while Rachel had none. Finally, Rachel had her son Joseph, we're told in 30:25, and at this point then, Jacob is ready to go back home. And he prepares to leave, and his uncle Laban again is ready to to try to outwit him, trying to get him to stay some more and work for him some more. And this time, Jacob, again, he's given, what he comes up with is a bargain here in which he's going to take all of Laban's sheep and all of his sheep, and he will take care of all of them for some time to come. All the speckled ones that are not plain colored, will be his, and all the others will belong to his uncle. Now, here again we see the conniving Jacob. He comes up with a plan that he's going to have the sheep and goats and whatever, they're going to conceive where he can make shadows, and he thinks those shadows somehow are going to affect it, and there are going to be a lot of speckled and spotted sheep and not very many plain ones. Now, the Bible does not give any credence whatsoever to this as something that actually happened. In fact, God did multiply the speckled and spotted sheep and goats so that the things of Jacob grew and those of Laban decreased. But Jacob understood that it was not him, it was God. Listen to what he says in chapter 31 when he's talking to Laban. God has taken away, or he's talking to his wives, God has taken away the cattle of your father, and he has given it to me. Jacob now began to realize it was not his cleverness, but God's blessing. As we move on then, we see that Laban is angry after Jacob leaves, and he comes after him, and the end of it is that he says to him, there'll be no more life between you and me. I don't trust you, and you don't trust me, and we'll see to it that we don't meet again. The interesting thing is that it's called the Mizpah benediction. You may have heard of it. The Lord watch between you and me while we're absent one from the other. Now, the way that's usually recited among young people, I know, and maybe you all have known of this, it's a parting word. We are good friends, and we won't see one another for a while. And as we part, we'll hope God will watch over us and bring us back safely again. That's not at all the context. What he is saying here is, the Lord watch between me and you when we are absent one from another. If you afflict my daughters, if you take my other wives beside, God is witness. In other words, Laban and Jacob are saying, I don't trust you. And while we can't watch one another, I hope God will watch out for me. That's what it really meant. Well, it's at this point then, he's left Laban, the doors there are closed, he gets the news that Esau, last words he heard about Esau is he will kill him when he saw him again. Now he hears Esau's coming with an army of men with him. That brings him to this great moment when he says, Lord, I'm not worthy. Here Jacob is humbled. Here we begin to see the true greatness of this man, a man of faith. He's already acknowledges that what he has, God has given him. He now says, I'm not worthy of all you've given me. He calls for the mercy of God. And that night, by himself, he wrestles with a man, we're told in verse 24. And in the end, he clings to this being that he wrestles with, and he calls him by name, Jacob, and he says, verse 28, your name will be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For you've striven with God, you've wrestled with God and with men, and you have prevailed. Now, to understand what God was trying to show him that night, and God by this was saying to him something tantamount to his saying to Abraham in chapter 22, I'm pleased with your faith. I'm pleased with what you've done. It's tantamount to that because he's basically saying here, I'm pleased with you now. To understand what he means, you've wrestled with man and with God and you've prevailed. We have to go back and see just what's happened. Number one, he had tried to deal with Esau and Laban by his own clever devices, and he had miserably failed. They, in the end, were a great danger to him, and all his sins were coming back on his own head. It was at that point that he turned from trusting in his own cleverness, you see, to trust in God. Lord, I can't extricate myself from the mess I've gotten myself into. I can't go back where I came from. Laban will kill me. I can't go forward because Esau's there and I can't compete. Lord, help me. And in his trust in God, he would prevail over Esau, and we'll see how he prevailed. On the other hand, in his dealings with God, he had tried to bargain with God. He had tried to get God to work out a deal with him, and that had miserably failed. He finally realized that he was unworthy of anything God had given him. And he humbled himself before God. He surrendered to God. So the way you wrestle with men, your enemies, and prevail is by your trust in God. The way you wrestle with God, deal with God, and triumph is by surrender. By complete surrender to the Lord. And this is what happened in the case of the man Jacob. And that's why his name was called Israel, which means one who wrestles with God. And in fact, Paul in Romans writes this: they are not all truly Israel that are of Israel. He meant by that, not everybody that's born a Jew, and not everybody called an Israelite is truly an Israelite, in the sense that God meant by that name. Because only those who surrendered to God are the true Israel of God. And Paul went on to say that includes Gentiles as well as Jews. They're the only ones that are rightfully to be called the Israel of God. The succeeding episodes deal with the children of Jacob, and to some extent with the leadership in the family, that is, who was going to be heir to the leadership in the family of Jacob. In chapters 34 down through 38 show to us the situation in terms of leadership among the sons of Jacob. In chapter 34 we're told of the matter of Dinah, his daughter, who was taken by the citizens of Shechem and humbled by them, and one of the princes of Shechem wanted her as his wife. And the brothers of Dinah were concerned for their daughter's well-being, and they made a bargain. They said, if you men will all be circumcised, then we will let you marry our daughter. But in other words, you've got to become Jews. We've got to become part of us. Now, their intent was not to keep that bargain, but when the men were all circumcised and sore and unable to get up and defend themselves, at that point Simeon and Levi, two of the older sons of Jacob, came in and murdered them, slaughtered the whole city of men. Jacob heard about it, and he said in verse 30 to Simeon and Levi, you have troubled me to make me odious, and he had to leave. And it hadn't been long after that Jacob discovered that Reuben, his oldest son, verse 22 of chapter 35, had gone in and lain with his concubine, and Israel heard about that. And the impact of this is that Reuben, by this act, was claiming to be the successor of his father. He was taking over right then. It was a symbolic thing that was meaningful in the Near East in that period of human history. That if a man went in and took the concubines of the ruler as his own, that meant he had the power to take over. And this act of Reuben was really rebellion. And Jacob kept it all in his mind. Chapter 37 is one of the sorrier chapters in the whole episode of Jacob. In chapter 37, we have the account of Joseph and his brothers. Now, you remember that Joseph was the brother or the son of Rachel, and the others, except for Benjamin, were the sons of Leah. And we're told that Jacob, because he had loved Rachel, favored Joseph. And we're told that he did a lot of things for him. He was the son of his old age, and he made him a special coat of many colors. And he showed open favoritism to Joseph. Jacob was not wise in this. The brothers began to feel hurt about it because Israel loved Joseph more than all of the rest of his children. And then we read that Joseph dreamed a dream, and he went to his brothers and said, "Hey, I've got a dream. And in this dream, my sheaf stands up and all your sheaves bow down to it." This is not a pretty picture of Joseph. There is an ugly pride here that cannot be ignored. He is the favorite of his father. He says, "I'm going to end up on top. You sons of Leah, you're nothing." But his pride got away from him. Just ran away. He had another dream, and in this one he saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down to him. Even his mother and father were going to bow down to him. The man was filled with conceit and arrogance and pride. Sometimes we fail to miss this reality in the account of Joseph. We think him always just a really wonderful fellow. But not only that, we're told that when his father sent him out to see about his brothers when they were shepherding, he came back and he brought an evil report of them. Now, in the Bible terminology, that use of that term evil report means a whole lot more than just that he brought back a report and it really wasn't so good. The brothers were not doing very well and maybe doing things they shouldn't. In other words, he's not just a tattletale. The only other place that the word evil report is used is in the context of Moses sending the spies down, you remember, into Canaan, and they came back out of Canaan, and it said they brought an evil report. And what they brought was a report that was harmful to Israel. And what Joseph did was harmful. They brought a report that showed no faith. And what Joseph did was a report that showed no faith. Whatever he said to his father, it's not what he should have said. Well, the brothers had all they could take, and they, as you know, sold Joseph down into Egypt, and they wouldn't hear any more about his dreams for a while. Joseph went down into Egypt, and we'll see that God humbled him there. And Joseph, in the crucible of Egypt, became a great man of God. Well, Reuben has failed. Levi and his brother have failed. And now Joseph has not done too well. He's out of the picture. There's only Judah left. And that's not a pretty picture either. Judah there saw a Canaanite in the land, and he married her, and the account tells us of how he got in trouble by his marrying her and having children by her, and then the children, because they would not in turn have children, they were punished with death. And in the process, his daughter-in-law Tamar, who now had a dead husband, and Judah, who had the responsibility to find her a husband, got busy with other things and didn't do it. And so Tamar, knowing no other thing to do, she was a Gentile, a Canaanite, and she pretended to be a harlot, and he didn't recognize her, and he went into her as though she were just a hired harlot. Later he found out that that was his daughter-in-law, and what he had done was a very sinful and shameful thing. And he said, when he learned it, in verse 26, she is more righteous than I. By which he ultimately meant, she's righteous and I'm not. Well, we don't find much hope in terms of leadership as we survey the family of Jacob. What's God going to do? In the chapters that come, we'll see that. We'll see how God begins to work in the life of the sons of Jacob. And how, by trying each one of them in different ways, we see them begin to mature in their spiritual life till they begin themselves to look more like Abraham. God had a lot of work to do, but we will see in there how God picks his man to be the one who truly becomes the leader of the people of God. Who is God's man? We know Jacob's man is Joseph. Who is God's man? We'll see that in the next section. Let's close in prayer. Our Heavenly Father, it's been good to be with you, to have this time in your Word. We thank you for what you've taught us, and pray that we may be good and faithful learners. We understand, Lord, that you are a patient God. You could bear with a Jacob, with a Joseph, with a Judah, with a Levi, with a Reuben. You could bear with these who seem to be such failures. And yet out of it you made a people that you were willing to call your people. How we thank you for that, O Lord. Because we know that you look at us and you see so much that displeases you, so much that's wrong, but you don't abandon us. Oh Lord, whatever crucible we must be crushed in, whatever trials we must endure, make us into that which would be well-pleasing in your sight. For we ask in Jesus' name, amen.